Hello, I am Maddie Dalrymple, and welcome to From Expertise to Authority, where we examine how you can build your professional presence for a sideline or second act. More resources are available at theindyauthor.com, and that's Indie with a Y, including a downloadable worksheet you can use to document your journey from expertise to authority. In this episode, we'll be exploring Publishing into the Void, why silence doesn't mean what you think it means. And if you'd like to read the text version or watch the video version of this content, you'll find those at Maddie Dalrymple on Substack and on YouTube. Sharing content that reflects your expertise is a key part of building authority. But the experience of doing so, especially at the early stages, can be jarring. You draft your first article or newsletter, or you record your first podcast episode and you send it out into the world, and then you wait. What comes back in many cases is silence. Not praise, not criticism, not even simple acknowledgement. Just silence that suggests that your content has landed nowhere and reached no one. If you've spent your career in a professional environment where your work involved regular interactions with colleagues, clients, or stakeholders, this silence can feel particularly disorienting. In that world, validation is woven into the fabric of the work itself. You present to a room and read faces. You send a proposal and receive a reply. You lead a meeting where even disagreement confirms that people are paying attention. You may not have thought of those interactions as validation at the time, they were just how work worked. But they provided a steady ambient signal that your expertise mattered and that your effort was registering. When you step into the world of authority building content, that signal disappears, partly because authority building is by its nature a solitary undertaking, one that depends on your own initiative and runs on your own schedule. Nobody assigns you a deadline, nobody reviews your draft, nobody sits across a conference table reacting to your ideas in real time. Building a professional presence through content requires a kind of self-sufficiency that most careers never demanded. The ability to set your own benchmarks for quality and progress, and to develop an internal sense of whether the work is good. You have to become your own judge of whether the article you just wrote meets your standards and whether the trajectory of your work is heading somewhere meaningful. That's a significant shift for someone accustomed to routine external validation, and its absence can feel in the early months like evidence that the work isn't landing. But silence doesn't mean your content isn't reaching people, and understanding why requires a distinction that turns out to be foundational to sustaining the effort. Let's talk about engagement without interaction. When I launched the Indie Author podcast, I hoped listeners would reach out, leave comments, send emails, engage with the content in some visible way. For dozens of episodes, very little of that happened. The first time someone I didn't know mentioned that they listened to the podcast, it came as a genuine shock, which was its own contradiction since I'd been hoping for exactly that kind of confirmation, and yet somehow hadn't prepared myself for the reality that actual strangers were on the other end of the microphone. But then I thought about my own behavior as a podcast listener, and the disconnect became understandable. I subscribe to podcasts I love, I listen to them regularly, and have had my thinking shaped by episodes whose hosts would have no way of knowing I ever tuned in. I interact with that content deeply, I just don't interact with the creator. I am more diligent about reaching out to hosts now, precisely because I understand the shouting into the void dilemma from the other side, but for years I consumed faithfully, but silently. This is the foundational distinction. People engaging with your content is not the same thing as people engaging with you. Your readers and listeners may be absorbing your advice, applying your frameworks, recommending your content to colleagues, all without generating a single notification on your end. The content is doing its work. The feedback structure just doesn't surface it. My friend and colleague Angelique Fawns, a horror fiction writer who built Authority as a resource for short fiction writers, experienced this vividly. She'd been publishing information on the short fiction market for months without knowing whether any of it was reaching the people she hoped to serve, until she attended a writers' conference and found herself being thanked by writers who had been following her work all along. The audience had been there, the screen just couldn't show it to her. As with Angelique, the most meaningful evidence of engagement for me has come at in-person events where someone mentions a specific episode or article. These encounters don't create the engagement, they reveal engagement that was already happening. So if silence after you publish isn't a useful signal, if it tells you nothing about whether your content is reaching people, then what sustains the work in the meantime? Let's talk about content worth creating for its own sake. Understanding the feedback gap intellectually is one thing. Surviving it emotionally, continuing to produce content week after week without evidence of its reaching anyone, requires something more. The content has to be worth creating even if no one's listening. And I don't mean this as a platitude, I mean it as a practical survival strategy. If the only reason you're creating authority-building content is to build authority, silence will erode your momentum before you've had a chance to find your audience. The professionals who sustain their effort through the feedback void are the ones whose content rewards them directly, independent of audience response. For me, the Indie Author Podcast was worth producing from the very first episode because the interviews themselves were valuable to me as I developed my own independent publishing business. My conversation with fellow Brandywine Valley Writers Group member Tony Conaway about the craft and business of short fiction, that was episode 9 when my audience was negligible, was my first serious exploration of a topic that eventually led to a co-authored book, speaking engagements, the opportunity to judge short fiction contests, an invitation to write a foreword for a short fiction anthology, and an entirely new dimension to my professional life. My interview with Philadelphia area author Ken Lozito about making the move to full-time writing gave me an insider's perspective on what the transition would actually require, information I needed for my own career, regardless of whether anyone else ever heard the conversation. The content I was creating to build authority was simultaneously building my own expertise, and that dual purpose made it sustainable in a way that pure audience building never could have. When you're writing a Substack article that clarifies your own thinking, or recording an interview that deepens your understanding of your field, the audience is a bonus rather than the point. There's a final dimension to publishing into the void that only becomes visible in retrospect. Consistency compounds in ways that no individual piece of content can. Over the course of several hundred podcast episodes, published sporadically in the early years, then bi-weekly after I left my corporate job in 2019, and then weekly beginning in 2020, I've become a familiar figure in the indie publishing world. No single episode produced that result. No viral moment created it. It accumulated gradually, below the threshold of any feedback mechanism, until one day it was simply true, and the evidence showed up not as listener metrics, but as opportunities. I became a go-to resource for Writer's Digest on indie publishing topics. The Alliance of Independent Authors invited me to serve as their campaigns manager. Consulting clients and speaking engagements materialized, including a keynote at a writers' conference. None of these opportunities arrived because of one episode. They arrived because years of consistent presence had built a kind of professional credibility that no single piece of content could have created on its own. This is the hardest thing to convey to someone publishing their first piece of authority-building content because it requires faith in a process whose evidence is deferred by months or even years. But it's also the most honest thing I can say. The professionals who build durable authority aren't the ones who got the most immediate feedback. They're the ones who found reason to keep going without it. The good news is that publishing into the void doesn't mean resigning yourself to permanent silence. There are practical steps you can take to encourage and surface the engagement that's already happening, and that's what we'll explore next. If you'd like to read the article this episode was based on, you'll find that at Substack at Maddie Dalrymple. And if you'd like support developing a personalized pathway from expertise to authority for yourself, please check out my consulting service at theindieauthor.com/authority. If you're an event organizer, I'd love to share with your community a framework they can use to develop their own path. And if you'd like to get in touch, just drop me a note at maddie@maddiedalrymple.com. Thank you for listening.